This is Hope, Tools to Successfully Navigate Our Sexualized Screens and World. That's right. Welcome back to the class whose name is so long it took me all summer to say it one time. This is our last week together. And so I want to really quick say what the plan is. I want to kind of take a giant step back and kind of look at the broadest application of the tools that we've looked at so far. I want to tie up just a couple loose ends. We'll say goodbye to the books that we've been in. And then I want to send you guys off with a bang, or at least with some encouragement. So this week is Hope. Imagine that. This is where if we actually had a budget, we would put in a clip from Arrested Development where the narrator goes, "Hey, that's the name of the show." I wanted to say that when really early in the developmental process of this class, I knew I wanted to name it Hope. For a couple reasons. One is I think it's actually really important, and it was a common theme throughout everything we've been talking about. But also, hope has always kind of stuck out to me as the odd one out. Right, because when you get to the theological virtues, when you talk about faith, hope, and love, right, those three virtues are scattered throughout the New Testament more than a couple of times, and they're always grouped together. And hope always stuck out to me because hope was the only one that didn't get its own dedicated passage, right? Faith has Hebrews 11, right, the hall of faith, right? By faith, Noah, by faith, Abraham, by faith, Moses, right? And then love has 1 Corinthians 13, which if you ever want a passage about a specific topic, like here's a passage that non-religious people know by heart because it's overused in weddings. So faith has its own dedicated chapter, and love has its own dedicated chapter, and hope is just kind of the odd man out. Or I felt that way when I was growing up. Now I'm a little older, and I think there's a couple reasons that hope doesn't have its own dedicated chapter. And I think one of those reasons is not everything has to be all neat and tidy and symmetrical. All right, maybe it's just my OCD a little bit that says, "Hey, I want everything to have its own chapter," and God's kind of like, "No, God has ordered the world in a way that still allows for some messiness." So let's move in. We're going to talk about hope eventually. I promise we'll get there. I want to start out this week in a weird place by introducing us to a new book, which might seem odd, but it'll make more sense when I say only one or two of the chapters in this book are actually about pornography or sexual struggles. This book is a new kind of apologist. And I want to start off by explaining what the word apologist means because, well, I'm sure most of you will know. I just want to cover my own backside because people don't know this word. Apologist does not mean apologizing, at least in the modern sense, though they do share a root, right? When you apologize, when you say sorry, that comes from the same root as apologist, and the root means to give an account for. So like when you apologize, it's like, say, "Hey, explain yourself," right? Apologetics is the field. It's the field of Christianity, or I guess of defending Christianity, to use a modern turn of phrase, with facts and logic, right? You see those YouTube videos destroyed by facts and logic. That's apologetics, can we defend our faith using historical evidence, using logical reasonings, using tools, let's say, outside of the Bible to prove the veracity of the Bible. So this book is a collection of essays. Each chapter is its own essay from a different author. And so the one chapter that we're going to look at today is Chapter 20 by John Stonestreet. And he begins, I'm not going to read from it quite yet because I think I can do it a little faster. He begins by talking about the different methods that Christians have used in the past to teach about sex or to instruct people on sex. And let's say throughout most of the 1900s, we can confidently say, for the most part, Christians used what we'll call the fear method, which is don't have sex outside of marriage, or you'll get an STD, or you'll get pregnant outside of marriage, right? The fear method is all about, well, this might happen and you don't want that to happen, so you better play it safe. And the fear method obviously has some problems. First off, it's pragmatic. The fear method says, don't do this because there are risks involved. And that's a problem because if you can eliminate the risks, then you eliminate all the reasons not to do it. And look at where we've come. Look at the, let's say, quality of the birth control we have now and how many STDs are curable or at least manageable to the point where it's really not impacting your life. So we've reached a point as a culture where we've eliminated or at least mediated the risks to the point where, all right, we can have sex now, no problem. That's the first problem with the fear method. The second problem is that when you teach people for a long time, this thing is bad, it's really hard, at least for some people and maybe a lot of people, to transition to this thing is good now that I have a ring on. And so it might be loading people down with unnecessary baggage, and just in general, it's I think we can agree it's not an effective method. So I'm going to read from the book now. And so it says, today, the favorite approach seems to be what one of my friends has labeled princess theology. In this view, chastity guarantees a marital happy ending. Stay pure, students are told, and God will write your love story. Save sex for marriage, and God guarantees your best sex now with Prince Charming or Princess Charming. Well, statistics do, of course, tell us that married couples have the most satisfying sex lives, but it is neither a money-back guarantee nor a divine wedding gift. What those statistics reveal is the emotional and physical security provided by marriage. In fact, there are 3 reasons Christian leaders should never perpetuate princess theology. First, the Bible never promises it. Christians rightly believe that God is sovereign over our lives and human history, and in this sense, he does write our love stories. However, we mustn't forget that God wrote Hosea's love story too. And many biblical stories with beautiful beginnings did not have terrific endings. Israel's patriarchs come to mind. Second, human nature cannot deliver it. Biblical stories clearly reveal, and universal human experience confirms, that no one is Prince Charming. Marriage involves 2 people, and one spouse's purity does not guarantee the other's. In fact, we risk teaching husbands and wives to approach their spouse in a demanding, selfish way, as if, since they played by the rules, God owes them a perfect spouse. But what of potential life challenges that interfere with sexual happiness, such as illness or disability? What of sexual addiction or frigidity? What of infidelity or abandonment? These situations happen. Third, our current culture cannot sustain it. We live in a time where the average age that women first marry is older than the average age they have their first child. Nearly 1 in 4 females and 1 in 6 males will be sexually abused by age 18. Average first exposure to pornography by internet users is estimated to be at age 8. And rates of porn addiction are at epidemic levels. In this sexually broken environment, how many young adults can we reasonably expect to emerge unscathed? The old youth group line, "Be a virgin, marry a virgin," is unhelpful. To what are we referring? A technical virgin? Someone who has never made a sexual mistake of any kind? In that economy, how many marriageable candidates would be left? And what does this say about the restoring work of the gospel? Admittedly, my descriptions of Christian sex education are overgeneralizations and, at times, exaggerations. But I'm trying to make a larger point. We need to rethink how we communicate biblical sexuality both inside and outside the church. Living and communicating a genuinely biblical view of sexuality is a powerful apologetic today. We never operate in a cultural vacuum. Our culture has undergone more than a moral slip into debauched activities. It's undergone a worldview shift. Our gut-level understanding of sex, relationships, love, and marriage has changed dramatically in the following ways. First, how it's experienced. It wasn't easy to find sexually explicit material when I was a teenager. Maybe a friend could sneak his dad's Playboy, or maybe we could sneak a peek at a convenience store. Today, however, there is unlimited and immediate access to sexually explicit materials of all kinds. The internet, smartphones, social media, and mainstream entertainment virtually ensure that we are all consistently exposed to various forms of sexual brokenness. As Josh McDowell once told me, the question for parents isn't whether our children will see pornography, but when. And, of course, things once taboo, never mentioned, are now fodder for sitcom jokes, pop music lyrics, or heartwarming family-friendly movies. Further, the kind of sexual brokenness we experience in our culture is predatory. One mother told me how shocked she was when her 9-year-old asked, "What's a pervert?" When she asked him where he heard that word, he told her it was from an online pop-up ad that interrupted his homework. Not knowing what it meant, he clicked on the ad and was exposed to pornography for the first time. He wasn't looking for it. It was looking for him. In light of all of this, churches should assume that because most of us have encountered sexuality early and often in a society committed to tolerance and resistant to moral judgments of any kind, we have had very few years of sexual innocence. Not only do we have little control over what sexually explicit images we encounter, we do not choose what definitions, philosophies, and arguments about sexuality we encounter. We live in a sexually pluralistic society. Let me review the last sentence there. Our gut-level understanding of sex, relationships, love, and marriage has changed dramatically in the following ways. 2. How sexuality is understood. An old Chinese proverb says that if you would like to know what water is, you shouldn't ask a fish. Cultural norms powerfully shape our gut-level ideas about the world and ourselves. Thus, it is crucial to understand which gut-level assumptions about sexuality our culture is smuggling into our thinking. Sexuality has been radically privatized. It used to be that privacy ended at the bedroom door, and care was given to which views, attitudes, and behaviors about sex were allowed in the public square. Today, however, pornography, medical technology, and public policy advances as if there are no levels of public accountability. The Student Center in Shippensburg University, Pennsylvania, offers vending machines for soda, snacks, and Plan B. Following suit, the FDA decided in 2013 that Plan B should be available over the counter in pharmacies without a prescription to girls of any age. I want to take a quick aside because abortion is a very hot topic, and at least to point out those last two caveats given. Without a prescription to girls of any age. Apparently, both the university and the feds believe that not even doctors should have opinions about a patient's sexual behavior, even if it's risky or involves a minor. Gone are the days when red-faced males had to face convenience store clerks with their pornography purchases. We now surf the internet alone on handheld devices. When British Prime Minister David Cameron proposed to counter the predatory behavior of online pornography, that the default setting for internet providers be to block sexually explicit websites unless the user specifically requested access, he was made out by many to be an enemy of free speech. Apparently, many people think unrestricted access to pornography is a basic human right. Our sexual activities are best kept to ourselves, but it's a mistake to think that sex is purely private. There are public consequences for others, for family units, for societies, and for nations. We once thought citizens accountable for the consequences of their sexual activities, but no longer. Whereas the government historically regulated against certain sexual behaviors it deemed dangerous or damaging, though not always done well or with the best intentions, it now sees its role as ensuring unfettered sexual freedoms. And whereas marriage was long thought to be the best institution for protecting and, in a very real sense, regulating sex, that hasn't been the case for quite some time. Instead, the government is expected to expand the natural limits of marriage more and more so as to officially express approval of our autonomous sexual choices. At the root, let's think back to, I think it's week 2, maybe it was week 1, with the picture of the tree and the deep roots. At the root of these changes and shifting legal policies is the cultural shift I mentioned earlier. The recent song, "Take Me to Church" by the band Hozier proclaims that objects of our sexual desire are more properly understood as objects of adoration, and that the bedroom is an altar where we will find salvation. Sex is the good life, to be pursued without restrictions or accountability. At root, this song reveals a culture that has embraced a new vision of life, or, might we even say, a new religion. A culture requires a cultus. I'm going to take a break here because I had not come across this word before, cultus, and I didn't realize this either, which is why I want to point this out. I had no idea that culture, is a word we all familiar with, shares a root with the word cult. I don't know why that never clicked with me before, but cult and culture share a root. That root is cultus. What is a cultus? Our book here defines it as a sense of sacred order, a cosmology that roots moral demands within a metaphysical framework. Another definition I came across online is cultus might be thought of the kernel of truth, or the seed at the center of a fruit that is sacred, that you're not allowed to touch. What is the fundamental core ideal that you cannot touch? Cosmology is another term for worldview and consists of commitments about God, authority, human nature, and morality. Ours is a culture that considers God optional, authority self-determined, and morality relative. More importantly, human identity is reduced to sexual preferences and inclinations. To deny someone their sexual freedom is tantamount to denying their dignity. The church must understand that, given this cultural framework, biblical sexuality is not even taken seriously. Instead, it is dismissed as unbelievable from the start. It may seem hopeless to think that the Bible's life-giving version of sexuality can gain any traction in these cultural waters. But it's not. Bad ideas have bad consequences. We may soon rediscover, like generations before us, that the biblical vision is attractive amidst the chaos of sexual brokenness. In the meantime, here are some important things apologists today can do. 1. We can clarify the beautiful and holistic biblical vision of human sexuality. Before we determine what to do with something, we must know what that something is and what it is for. Biblical sexual norms are nonsensical outside of the biblical understanding of what sex is. I also want to take a moment and emphasize this because I think this is incredibly important, because there are Christians out there who are pushing Christian sexual norms, and failing first to push Christianity, if I may be so judgmental as to say so. And I think that is a mistake. I'm just going to read it again. Biblical sexual norms are nonsensical outside of the biblical understanding of what sex is. If you want people to lead Christianly sexual lives, they must first agree with the axioms of Christianity. So, we must start again to clarify and explain God's design. Here are 3 suggestions for doing this. First, churches must disciple their own. It is not enough to teach correct values and appropriate behavior. We must ground these values and behaviors over and over again in the biblical worldview of human identity as first and foremost bearers of God's image, and in the biblical worldview of sexuality as God's great gift that enables spouses to bear God's image in a new way as one in order to fulfill his purposes. Holy cow. This author must like Paul, because that is a run-on sentence that Paul could be proud of. I'm going to read it again, because holy cow. We must ground these values and behaviors over and over again in the biblical worldview of human identity as first and foremost bearers of God's image, and second, in the biblical worldview of sexuality as God's great gift that enables spouses to bear God's image in a new way as one, in order to fulfill his purposes. This is the why that makes sense of the what. Second, we must continuously counter the wrong definitions of love, human dignity, freedom, and marriage that are continuously being communicated by our culture. And we must consistently propose the biblical definitions of these concepts that are so much richer and truer. Words have meaning, and unless Christians are clear on definitions, our efforts will be futile. I want to say, just really as a quick aside, I do not generally highlight things in my books. I have that highlighted. Words have meaning. Our best seminars and books will only be moral window dressing on a wrong and damaging worldview if we can't be clear on definitions. All right. 2, we can offer hope and healing for the sexually broken, including ourselves. Paul told the church at Corinth, every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against his own body. Many churches and Christian leaders are falling for the very real temptation to assimilate to ever-changing sexual norms. The impulse is understandable. Stay relevant or alienate people from the gospel. But this is a devil's bargain. We may feel, as I often do, that love and truth are incompatible when it comes to heated issues like sexual orientation, marriage, divorce, and gender identity. However, only the gospel promises forgiveness of sin and reconciliation with God, ourselves, and others. By caving where the Bible is clear, we stand in the way of sinners finding what they need most. And this forgiveness is for us as much as it is for them. A sexually broken culture produces sexually broken Christians too. We need forgiveness as much as anyone else. 3, we can embody sexual wholeness as the better alternative that it is. Sexual brokenness is exhausting and unsustainable for both individuals and entire cultures. Sex, properly ordered, is life-giving in all kinds of ways. When not properly ordered, it dehumanizes and victimizes. There is, and will be, no shortage of victims of our sexual hubris. Let's remember that we are not the first Christians located in a culture hell-bent on sexually exhausting itself. The earliest Christians found themselves in a world even worse than ours. Though the dominant myth is that puritanical Christians ruined all the pagan sexual fun, the truth is far different. As Rod Dreher explains, in fact, Paul's teaching on sexual purity and marriage were adopted as liberating in the pornographic, sexually exploitive Greco-Roman culture of the time. Exploitive especially of slaves and women, whose value to pagan males lay chiefly in their ability to produce children and provide sexual pleasure. Christianity, as articulated by Paul, worked a cultural revolution, restraining and channeling male eros, elevating the status of both women and of the human body, and infusing marriage and marital sexuality with love. This should give us hope. One of the church's callings is to offer good gifts to the world. Sex, properly understood and properly ordered, is one of God's best gifts. Potentially, this could be one of our best tools for pointing the world to the giver of the gift. Let's get on with it. Great opportunities await us. So, I wanted to include that just as a kind of, we've been working on all these tools, but ultimately let's point this to the idea of apologetics, to the idea of going forth and making disciples. And hopefully, my hope of this class is you can use some of these tools to order your life, but ordering your life is only part of your mission. Yes, you do want to clean up your life, and I want you to clean up your life, but also to go out and make disciples. All right? I'm going to jump right into our next bit here. We're going to kind of say goodbye here to surfing for God. Last week we said goodbye to Unwanted, and we're going to briefly say goodbye to Pure Desire later tonight. So we're just kind of giving our fond farewell to these books. So, jumping right in. This chapter starts out, kind of surprisingly, "Jim, you're an alcoholic," the doctor explained. This was no surprise, since my father had been attending Alcoholics Anonymous for more than 4 years. In 1972, at the age of 39, Dad had binged on alcohol after nearly 5 years of continued sobriety. A blue-collar printing pressman, he had been working 2 full-time jobs and a part-time job. When he reached his inevitable limit, he experienced what back then was euphemistically called a nervous breakdown. To cope, Dad returned to the bottle, the only viable option he knew at the time. A friend from AA drove him to the hospital where he began treatment. After a week of extensive mental health assessments, his psychiatrist, a straight-shooting Irishman, announced that he had reviewed the data and made a conclusive diagnosis. My father braced himself for the worst. "Your problem is that you're immature," the doc pronounced. "You need to grow up and learn to live without alcohol." Dad walked back to his hospital room, where he sat for a long time to ponder the doctor's words. "I decided he was right," he told me later. "When I walked out of the room, I decided I would do whatever it took to live without alcohol to grow up." And grow up he did. Almost 40 years later, he still hasn't touched a drink. But even better still, his journey of recovery has led him to become the man that one day I hope to be. Let's back up a little bit. The book of Exodus is probably best known for its portrayal of the Israelites' miraculous deliverance out of Egypt. Most of the story, however, describes the dealings of a loving God who relentlessly pursues his beloved people, despite the fact that they had neither worshipped him nor walked with him the previous 480 years. Their previous oppression, abuse, and religious persecution turned them into a nation that no longer knew how to walk with God. Like my father, who needed to face his immaturity and learn to live without alcohol, the Israelites needed to grow up and learn to live as God's free, chosen people. During the Israelites' 40 years of wandering in the desert, they repeatedly turned away from God and worshipped idols. But always faithful, God pursued them. In the book of Jeremiah, God addressed the Israelites during one of their many cycles of idolatry and disobedience. Because God's sons were engaged in spiritual and physical adultery, he used an unusual series of images filled with sexual overtones to describe his people. "This is what the Lord says to the men of Judah and to Jerusalem. Break up your unplowed ground, and do not sow among thorns. Circumcise yourselves to the Lord. Circumcise your hearts. you men of Judah and people of Jerusalem. Jeremiah 4:3 and 4. God told his people to break up their unplowed ground, referring not to soil, but to the ground of their hearts. The Israelites' hearts had grown hard and unreceptive, like parched land that can't absorb rainfall. The soil of their hearts had become barren and unable to grow anything. In order to yield a harvest, the fallow ground needed to be broken. Their hearts needed to be broken in order to absorb God's love. Next, God warned the Israelites not to sow among thorns, meaning they were planting seeds in places that were unable to bring forth life. Their worship of idols was akin to planting seed in thorny ground. With their hearts unplowed and their seeds planted among thorns, their actions prevented them from giving or receiving, blessing or being blessed. Finally, God commanded the Israelites to circumcise their hearts. What? I'm sorry. Let me try that again. What? Have you ever wondered what in the world cutting off the foreskin of the penis has in common with our faith in God? Wouldn't it be a whole lot easier if God just asked for a lock of hair? But God instructed the men of Judah and Jerusalem to circumcise their hearts. Why circumcision? The story of circumcision goes back to Genesis 17, when God appeared to Abram at the ripe old age of 99. By this time, he and his wife, Sarai, assumed that they were never going to have children. But God made a covenant with Abram that resulted in a promise, a new identity, and a command. God promised Abram that he would make him fruitful despite not having any children at the time. God gave him a new identity, changing Abram's name to Abraham and Sarai to Sarah. But God also commanded Abraham to circumcise every male descendant, to cut away the foreskin of the penis. Circumcision was an act of surrender to God, a way to remember God's promise, and a means of marking God's people with a new identity. You may still be asking, why the penis? Why not the lock of hair? What was God hoping to accomplish by cutting away a man's foreskin? Circumcision represents at least three things. First, a man's penis represents his masculine identity, reaching beyond social and cultural definitions of manhood. It symbolizes the way a man uses his strength, to move towards others and enter their space, to bless or curse, to give or take, to deposit or withdraw. In circumcision, a man surrenders his masculine identity to God. Cutting away the foreskin required a man to bear the weight of redemptive suffering. Second, cutting off the foreskin of the penis represented the paring away of the hidden self. This hidden and private part of a man was reserved for the most intimate of relations. No one else had access to his innermost part. But God established his relationship with Israel in this most intimate of rituals. Further, ever since Adam and Eve covered themselves with fig leaves, we have mastered the art of hiding our true selves. I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid, said Adam. By commanding men to be circumcised, God pulled back the fig leaf of shame, requiring us to be naked, but not hide. Finally, the foreskin and penis symbolize the part of us that gives life. From a reproductive slant, the penis enables men to be fruitful and multiply. But a man is called to give life, to be fruitful, in areas far beyond sexual intercourse. A man has the potential to pour life into others through word and deed. Relationally, we bear a life-giving capacity to bless or curse, serve or exploit, encourage or discourage. In the depths of our masculine souls, we have a capability to love or to remain indifferent, to give or to take. Ultimately, we each decide whether we will grow up. As we grow up, we are transformed from brokenness to wholeness, emptiness to fullness, and self-absorption to other-centeredness. The result is that we can more freely give life. Circumcision of the heart is just as symbolic as circumcision of the flesh. Paul tells us that a man can be physically circumcised without being spiritually circumcised. In Romans 2:28 and 29, Paul writes, A man is not a Jew if he is only one outwardly, nor is circumcision merely outward and physical. No, a man is a Jew if he is one inwardly, and circumcision is circumcision of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the written code. Circumcision of the penis is an external act of surrender, remembrance, and new identity. Circumcision of the heart represents these same three realities internally. When Jesus criticized the Pharisees because they honored him with their lips, but their hearts were far from him, Matthew 15:8, he might as well have said, "You honored me by surrendering your foreskins, but you haven't surrendered your hearts." Going through the motions is not what God desires. He wants our external and internal selves to come into alignment. We circumcise our hearts as a symbol of our internal love and devotion to God. A circumcised heart gives God access to our hidden selves, establishes our new identities, and offers life to others. Now, in the battle against lust and porn, most Christian approaches stress the importance of accountability. In my experience, however, what we need more than accountability is accessibility. During my sexual struggles, I was held accountable by friends and mentors who were among the most insightful and highly trained men around. But I didn't have the ability or desire to let those men into my heart. Here is an excerpt from my July 1994 journal. The most surprising, confounding, and tragic aspect of my actions is that long before I deceived anyone else, I deceived myself. For at least 2 years in our marriage, a growing, cancerous growth of falsehood attached itself to me. I've said all along, that's not a deadly tumor, it's just a blemish. As each sexual boundary has been crossed, I've minimized, rationalized, excused, or done penance. I've closed myself off to friends, telling them a fraction of what's really happening. I've closed myself off to God, trying harder to do the things I thought would please Him. I am an arrogant, stubborn-hearted, self-sufficient man. Lord, I believe you resist the proud and give grace to the humble. Humble me. I need your grace and truth like never before. End of journal entry. When my friend Jeffrey's multiple adulterous affairs were exposed, I asked him how I might help. He told me what he really needed most was an accountability relationship. Something inside me sank. Really? Your marriage is dangling by a thread and you want accountability? When I asked what he had in mind, he told me he was hoping for someone who would check in with him regarding his quote-unquote purity level. A colleague had given him a list of accountability questions. Would I meet with him every week to review them? Jeffrey desperately needed accountability. The tragedy is that, like many men today, his understanding of accountability was dreadfully inadequate. Accountability is usually approached in 3 ways: 2 common and 1 less common. I call the first common approach cop accountability. Our chosen accountability partner represents law enforcement, and we are the law-abiding citizen with a proclivity for exceeding the posted limits of appropriate sexual behavior. When we exceed the lawful limits, we turn ourselves over to a law enforcement officer who issues the appropriate citation. I wish I could say that my description here was written entirely in jest, but I would be lying. With the cop accountability strategy, I believe that by sharing my sin with someone, I will have greater incentive to choose what is right. It's about the avoidance of shame. This form of accountability is a gospel of sin management, and it's all too common and fraught with problems. The most obvious issue with this approach is that every addict is a master of at deception. We lie. It's what addicts do. I've lied while looking in the eyes of my wife, my best friend, my mentor. Next, this approach relies on external reinforcement. When removed, the compulsive and addictive behaviors return. Also, This form of accountability never deals with the heart. Jesus, on the other hand, said that sexual immorality begins in the heart. Very rarely do I hear men discussing their hearts with one another. We don't have a language for it. Finally, the man who lives under the cop accountability approach will eventually fail in one of the two ways. Either he will suffer from a chronic sense of failing to measure up, which only serves to reinforce shameful core beliefs, or he will succumb to pride, similar to the Pharisees of Jesus' day, resulting from his mastery of sin. Neither of these directions addresses what's actually going on, and they reinforce a gospel of sin management. The next approach is what I call coach accountability. Our accountability partner plays the role of an instructor, trainer, and coach who helps us manage our lives so we can keep moving forward. We are second-string players on God's team with a pretty good shot of making it to the spiritual big leagues. When we fail to perform well, we check in with the coach who encourages us from the rule book, sends us back in the game, and tells us to keep our eye on the ball. This approach implies that if we give it enough effort, time, and attention, we can earn a victory over sin and make our lives work. This try harder emphasis concerns itself less with sin management and more with the relentless effort to be good. It is a gospel of inspiration. Coach accountability is better than cop accountability. At various times in our lives, all of us need a friend or loved one to get in our face like a cop and say, "Stop!" In the same way, all of us periodically need encouragement, hope, and even training or equipping about how to do life. We occasionally need that coach who will come alongside us and inspire us to do our best. But ultimately, we need someone to care for our hearts. Every man needs cardiologist accountability. In the midst of my struggle, I lacked a safe place to talk about my brokenness. I had no language to talk about my heart and my inner world. Nobody ever asked me if lust was a struggle for me. No one ever asked me why, at 23 years of age, I had never gone on a date or had a girlfriend, or why I had a compulsive need to be funny. We need someone to ask us questions not only about our behavior, but also about our hearts. We need a friend who will ask us questions about the lies we believe and help us interpret the stories that contribute to who we are today. In the cardiologist approach, we move from accountability to accessibility. We expose our hiddenness, but more than that, we acknowledge our brokenness. Instead of trying to manage sin or be inspired to obey, we recognize our need for transformation. We begin to allow God and a few others to walk into the messiness of our lives, and we learn that we are more than the sum of our brokenness. Cardiologist accountability does not require a professional therapist or counselor. It begins with the assumption that our whole lives, including our brokenness, are the soil in which God grows us. The only requirement for becoming a cardiologist of this kind are a healthy curiosity, a desire to be a caring friend, and a willingness to grow in your understanding of the process of spiritual transformation. A number of years ago, my friend Ian Cron wrote some lyrics to a song that described this work of healing. I own a secret I learned long ago. Love is like going under the knife. We go with great trembling and fear in our hearts, but when we wake up, we find our lives. If we want to grow up and learn to live without the cancer that slowly devours our souls, we must go under the knife. The surgery in our souls can only be performed by the great physician. And, like any reputable surgeon, Jesus will not operate without our consent. What does this surgery look like? Certainly, it involves the everyday, sometimes mundane, act of following Jesus through the daily trials of life. But we also need Jesus to operate on our hidden parts, our false identities, and the areas that have turned inward and become a prison of self. Fortunately, Jesus really does heal. God promises to set captives free and heal broken hearts. But someone once told me that in the Gospels, Jesus never heals two blind men the same way. Sometimes he lays hands on them. Sometimes he just speaks a prayer. Sometimes he spits in the dirt and makes mud and rubs that on the guy's eyes. Sometimes the healing work of Jesus occurs over time, like a fractured bone that is set in a cast and then given time to fuse together. At other times, Jesus heals in an instant. Regardless of the manner in which healing occurs, the work of healing always flows from the good heart of God who seeks to restore us. One last story. Mark was a pastor in his 50s with a flourishing church. When his wife caught him watching online porn for the third time, she courageously told him he needed to get help. On the first day that Mark participated in our soul care intensive, I instructed him to spend some time in silence, solitude, and centering prayer. On the second day, I asked him to describe his experience. He told me that his mind wandered, he thought it was a waste of time, and he questioned what the exercise had to do with his struggle with porn. I encouraged him to try again, and so he did. The third day, he brought me the same report. But this time I told him to begin his time with a prayer by asking Jesus a simple question. Jesus, what do you want to tell me? The next day, when Mark walked in the door, his eyes were filled with tears and he had a smile on his face. What's going on? I asked. You're not going to believe this, he told me, but God spoke to me. Jesus answered my question. In fact, when I asked him what he wanted to say to me, I heard a voice within tell me to get my journal and get ready. Immediately after retrieving his journal, he was so overcome with emotion that he laid face down on the floor. Over the next 30 minutes, Jesus spoke these words. Mark, you have no idea how much I love you. My heart for you is no different now than it was when you gave your life to me years ago. Every time you watched porn, I was right there loving you. I am proud of you, like a father with his son. Each time you surfed for porn, I know that you were really surfing for me. Mark, I want to heal you. Come to me with your broken heart. I want to teach you how to hear my voice. Come, be still, and know that I am God. Though he preached about grace, Mark was inwardly convinced that God was disappointed, frustrated, and fed up with him because of his sexual struggles. He had no clue that God could or would ever speak such words to him. Even more, he had no idea that such a relationship with God was possible. Each day over the course of the next few weeks, Mark took beginning steps of learning to be still in God's presence. And every day God spoke words of healing to Mark. He revealed intimate truth to counter Mark's shame-based core beliefs. He spoke words of affirmation, approval, and affection to counter the wounds from his dad's emotional absence. He spoke words of blessing and vision, assuring Mark that he had a future and a purpose in God's kingdom. In learning to be still, Mark discovered a whole new way to walk with God, a way of walking that brought real life to his soul. The most important experience for Mark occurred towards the end of our intensive. When Mark was 10, he discovered his father's stash of Playboy magazines in the drawer of an old dresser in the basement. Immediately, he was hooked, and soon he discovered masturbation. From then on, several times a week, he sneaked into the basement and drank in his father's porn with a mixture of thrill and fear. One day, he went to the basement and unknowingly witnessed his father masturbating to the porn. Each had seen the other, but Mark hurried back upstairs. He walked to his bedroom, buried his face in his pillow, and cried. The incident was never discussed. For reasons he couldn't explain, he felt that he needed to share this memory with me. As he did, we asked Jesus together what he wanted to do with this memory. No sooner had we begun to pray than, in the eyes of his heart, Mark saw himself in the basement as a little boy. That little boy was afraid, confused, and ashamed. In my office, Mark began experiencing those same feelings. He saw himself making a vow to never speak to anyone about what happened. Then, while reliving the experience, Jesus appeared in the basement with the little boy and asked a simple question. Will you let me circumcise your heart? Mark began to chuckle at the question. The 50-something pastor knew intellectually what this meant, but neither he nor the little boy knew what it meant practically. I encouraged Mark to ask the great physician what this meant. Jesus, what does it mean for you to circumcise my heart? He inquired. Graciously, Jesus responded with 3 more questions. Will you give me access to this hidden, private part of your heart? As I gain entry here, will you let me give you a new identity to replace your false identity that you're just like your dad? As you live in your new identity, will you let me make you fruitful in the place of your weakness and wounding? Without hesitation, Mark answered yes to all 3 of Jesus' questions. It was an absolutely beautiful, sacred moment. When Mark completed his soul care intensive, he understood that this was not the end of his journey, but the beginning. Our time together was not about fixing him or giving him an emotional experience that would wear off shortly after getting home. Instead, it was concerned with equipping him and giving him a launching pad into a life of restoration. This is the life that God calls each of us towards. To enter into this deeper, fuller life, however, we must learn to live without something. Like my father who needed to grow up and learn to live without alcohol. Like the Israelites who needed to grow up and learn to live freely without idols. And like Mark, who needed to grow up by learning to live without the barriers he'd built up to keep away the shame and inadequacy. If you are struggling with porn, it's likely that you struggle with hiddenness and false identity. And you have sought to find life apart from God. Have you circumcised your heart? So that's, we'll stop with surfing for God. And I want to kind of bring us back to the idea of hope. Those stories were hopefully educational and hopefully hopeful, but I want to get a little bit more explicit. In Pure Desire, I'm going to flip the slide here, but it's not going to make sense at first. The author, Ted Roberts, gives a story of when he was at a conference or some such thing, and he felt compelled by the Holy Spirit. They were praying, and he felt compelled to go and pray for a specific man. And so he did so. And while he was praying for the man, he knew the man worked on cars, not just any cars. He was a race car mechanic. He doesn't say in the book if it was NASCAR. I'm assuming it's something lower down. But still, he's working on race cars. And so Ted prays for the man. And he prays that the cars that he built would be some of the best on the track. Cars that could race and show God's glory. And this guy looks up at him while he's praying and says, I can do that? I can build cars for God? Roberts replied, you sure can. With your wrench and welding torch, you can preach to guys I could never reach. The reason I share this incident is that on that day, the day he first realized his God-given giftedness, the man was able to leave behind a smoking habit he battled for years. I think an important thing that maybe we don't talk about enough in church, or at least maybe I don't hear about it enough. Hell cannot create anything new. It can't make anything wholesale. It can only corrupt. Which means that if you have corrupted, or even not corrupted, they just seem neutral. If you have talents and passions, they are God-gifted. and hell can sure make a hell out of them, but they are God-given. That was a man who his passion was building cars. God gave him that. He absolutely can make cars for God. All right? Whether your passion is making cars or selling stocks or teaching history or making board games or creating music or growing flowers, all right? It doesn't matter what your passion is. It is a passion that God put there. Considering what this class is about and that you're listening, I might guess that you are at least reasonably passionate about sex. That is something else that God put there. And if you are, let's say, tempted, though that's the wrong word, to the idea that this could be something bigger or grander, in your life it feels kind of small, but you're like, this, in my heart, this feels like this has the potential to be beautiful, like a symphony or a sunset. It's like, God put that passion there. To quote another famous man, Martin Luther King said, "If a man is a street sweeper, then let him sweep as Michelangelo painted, as Beethoven wrote music, or Shakespeare wrote poetry. He should sweep streets in such a way that all the hosts of heaven turn and pause and say, 'Here is a great street sweeper who did his job well.'" Now, this last thing I want to do here, I won't say disappointed in. My own OCD was frustrated by, because I have tried very hard during this class to just keep to these books that I said I was going to keep to at the beginning. And these last couple weeks, as I've been preparing this last session, I was struggling how exactly to close it. And I came across a video, not in the process of preparing for this class, in my own personal life, just doing my own project. I came across this video. I'm like, oh, that's cool. I really like that. And I moved on. And I would work on the class, and that video kept coming back to me. And I'm like, no, but I didn't include it in week 1 when I laid out all my sources. And I just feel like God kept prompting me, like, nope, this is it. And so I'm like, all right. So I'm going to do something I've never done before and try to play a video. It's only 4 minutes. It's not too terribly long. This gentleman, his name is Alistair Begg. He is a pastor, I believe, in Ireland.
Without the preaching of the cross, without preaching the cross to ourselves all day and every day, we will very, very quickly revert to faith plus works as the ground of our salvation. So that, to go to the old Fort Lauderdale question, if you were to die tonight and you were getting entry into heaven, what would you say? If you answer that, and if I answer it in the first person, we've immediately gone wrong. Because I believed, because I have faith, because I am this, because I am continuing. Loved ones, the only proper answer is in the third person, because he. Think about the thief on the cross. And what an immense... I can't wait to find that fellow one day to ask him, how did that shake out for you? Because you were cussing the guy out with your friend. You've never been in a Bible study. You never got baptized. You didn't know a thing about church membership, and yet you made it. You made it. How did you make it? That's what the angel must have said. You know, like, what are you doing here? Well, I don't know. What do you mean you don't know? Well, because I don't know. Well, you know, let me get my supervisor. They go get the supervisor ranger. So, wait, just a few questions for you. First of all, are you clear on the doctrine of justification by faith? The guy said, I've never heard of it in my life. And what about, let's just go to the doctrine of Scripture immediately. This guy's just staring. And eventually, in frustration, he says, on what basis are you here? And he said, the man on the middle cross said, I can come. Now, that is the only answer. That is the only answer. And if I don't preach the gospel to myself all day and every day, then I will find myself beginning to trust myself, trust my experience, which is part of my fallenness as a man. If I take my eyes off the cross, I can then give only lip service to its efficacy, while at the same time living as if my salvation depends upon me. And as soon as you go there, it will lead you either to abject despair or a horrible kind of arrogance. And it is only the cross of Christ that deals both with the dreadful depths of despair and the pretentious arrogance of the pride of man that says, I can figure this out and I'm doing wonderfully well. No, because the sinless Savior died, my sinful soul is counted free for God the just is satisfied to look on him and pardon me. That's why Luther says most of your Christian life is outside of you, in this sense, that we know that we're not saved by good works. We're not saved as a result of our professions, but we're saved as a result of what Christ has achieved.
On what basis are you here? The man on the middle cross said, I can come. This is why I think that hope has no dedicated chapter in the New Testament, because the gospel itself is the passage of hope. And you could probably argue, it's like, well, no, the gospel itself is a message of love, and fundamentally I do agree with that. But what does the love do? It doesn't exist in a vacuum. It doesn't just sit and do nothing. All right? I had a pastor once asked the question to the congregation. He says, if you had to sum up the Bible in one verse, what would it be? And the correct answer that he gave, correct answer, quote unquote, but a fair amount of the congregations gave this answer before he confirmed it. He said, John 3:16, for God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever would believe in him would not perish, but have everlasting life, right? We know John 3:16. That's the sum up the whole Bible right there, right? You lose a lot of detail, but there's the important bits. You notice, that's love. That's clearly love. You can't argue that's not love. It's right there. For God so loved the world. But it doesn't stop there. It's not, for God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son. And that's it. Nothing happened. You earned hell and you're still going there. For God so loved the whole world and it changed nothing. No, that's not what it is. For God so loved the whole world and it changed everything. So, I hope that you have gotten something useful from this class. I hope that you go forth and you keep learning and you keep getting more tools. I hope that you share some of these tools with me. I hope you realize that it's not all about tools, that there is work to do. And work's never fun, but work is what actually gets stuff done. But even tools and work aren't enough because your blueprint is different from mine. You're building something different. So it's a whole journey. I hope you keep learning about yourself. for the last time that I'll say it in these videos, but I hope it's not the last time you hear it. You are accepted in Christ. You are secure in Christ. And you are significant in Christ.